Welcome to High Strangeness, where we ask questions and explore all that is strange and unexpected in our reality.
Welcome to High Strangeness. I'm Tony, and this is the place where we talk about all things strange and unexpected in our reality. Now, one of the strange things that happens in society is there are stories that we believe are history. And from time to time, things get revised and we see that things have changed. You wouldn't think history is one of those things that should change, but as we get more information, things change. So to me, unfortunately, so much of our history is, well, determined by those who write the history, and any perspectives and biases they have, that's now what becomes our history. So that's why it's important to take a look back at history from time to time and see what's been identified and what's new. Now, I don't know about everybody else, but for me, back in elementary school, I learned about the Pilgrims and the first Thanksgiving. And to this day, I still kind of have those thoughts of what happened back in those days. Now, I love Thanksgiving. It's one of my favorite holidays. I love what it stands for, and I appreciate all that was done by those before us to set up things so that we have good things today. And I do think that gratitude is extremely important in life. But maybe it's time to get a quick refresh on what I know about the Pilgrims, that Thanksgiving dinner, and the time frame around 1620-ish. And so that's why I'm excited to have my guest today, who is John Turner. He is the author of the book, They Knew They Were Pilgrims, the Plymouth Colony and the Contest for American Liberty. So with that, John, welcome aboard. Thank you for being on the call today. How are you doing today?
I'm great, and I'm pleased to be with you, and I think your podcast has just a great title.
That's awesome. Yeah, I know. It's just fun, and we like to dive into different things. Are you joining us from the New England area?
No, I actually live in Northern Virginia.
Okay.
Some folks down here think that the first Thanksgiving really took place in Virginia. So, I could have an argument with New Englanders about that if I wanted to.
Right, exactly. And how's 2024 been for you so far? We are now interviewing at the end of August. But have you had a good year so far?
I've had a great year. Yeah, we did some fun travel in the summer, and this is late August, so the fall semester is just about to begin at my university, which is George Mason University, not too far outside DC. Yeah, life's good.
Yeah, it's been a good year. It's been a good year. I hope the rest of the year continues to be good for everybody, for the country, because we have an election coming, and I hope everybody's civil as we go through that process. Um, just real quick before we get into anything, I just want to tell everybody that I just had some dental work. So I'm having trouble feeling half my face, my tongue, my nose feels stuffed up. So if I trip over my tongue, I'm sorry. It might just happen. I do feel like I'm uh, drooling continually too. Anyway, but let's get into it. John, before we go into too much, I was wondering if you could take a few minutes and just tell us a little bit about you, like what you do, your career path, hobbies, interests, and what got you into this topic and to write a book about this topic. Would you be able to do that for us?
Well, it will be the least interesting thing we talk about today, Tony. So I'm a historian. Um, I teach classes in both history and religious studies at my university. I really got into history. I honestly through two different ways. One, when I was growing up and my parents took me to church, the services were usually pretty boring, especially the sermons. So I would sort of read the Bible on my own, sitting there. And a lot of the Bible is history.
True.
Maybe not history the way, academics today do it, but it's historical narratives about, you know, honestly, all sorts of crazy and wild things. And I found that just fascinating. And then I got into simply reading books about history. I love books about the Reformation when I was a little bit older. And, you quickly realize that, to just play with the name of your podcast, history is just full of high strangeness.
Yes.
And you find things that are very similar about people in the past. Like they also had to have dental work, it just hurt a lot more. And you also find, you start to realize that different people in different times and places just really saw the world differently. And I think that's just really enriching and humbling and a good lesson for all of us.
Yeah. Great. I mean, thank you for writing this book. I mean, this is good for us to look back like this and see things dissected a little bit differently. Unless you're somebody who does hop into history and look at things, we walk away with something we've been taught a long, long time ago, and that just sits in our mind. And that's just kind of where things are. So that's one of the reasons why I'm loving that we're having this discussion, because I'm excited to learn some stuff today. And I know that your book, people should hop out there and grab it because it's going to give you all kinds of information. So, as we jump into this, I do want to see if we can start off with some general questions about the Pilgrims, the time frame, and we'll see where those things go. It'll lead us into your book at some point, and we'll just kind of see where we go. So, my first question to you is: in this time period, early 1600s, what really motivated the Pilgrims to leave home and to come here to the New World?
So it's a great question. And as you probably won't be surprised to hear, it's a somewhat long answer, because these are folks that had already left their homes in England, usually, in most cases, about a decade before the Mayflower. And they were individuals, for the most part. There's a bit of a mixture among the actual colonists, but the core of the group, they were people who had totally rejected the Church of England as a false church. And that was really controversial, not least because the queen or the king was the head of the church. So rejecting the church essentially was understood as sedition or treason. And people who totally rejected the church, they were known as separatists or Brownists, for one of their early leaders. And they were periodically persecuted. A number of them had been executed in the 1590s. And then in the middle of the first decade of the 1600s, King James kind of wanted to put the screws on these people again, and so did some of his bishops. And so, very prudently, a number of these separatists left England and took refuge in the Dutch Republic, where there was a much higher degree of religious liberty. To make a long story short, they weren't totally secure in their liberty there. They also didn't want to be Dutch or have their children become Dutch. So in the late 16 teens, they started thinking about establishing a colony in the New World. And they had a number of possibilities. They ended up aiming for somewhere just north of the mouth of the Hudson River. They got a little bit off track, hit Cape Cod, and I guess you could say the rest is history.
Yeah, right. A little bit off, but that's right. Who knows what our history would have been if they came a little bit south, I guess. Um, you mentioned that they stopped off somewhere for a little bit. Is this Leiden, or is that what that place is?
Leiden.
Leiden. Could you talk about
Yeah.
people hear that term, but what is that? That place, I mean.
Yeah, well, nowadays it's just a really beautiful, sort of small, medium-sized Dutch city. They went there in part because there was an English so critic of the Church of England named John Robinson, who established a church there. And it was about a third of that congregation that ultimately decided to become colonists and uh, ended up in what became known as Plymouth. So, they basically had gone there. They had prospered to a reasonable degree. Some of them were the Dutch Republic in general was fairly hospitable for newcomers, and so they'd done okay there. But a lot of these people were, they originally had been farmers, or in some cases craftsmen, and they didn't quite exactly fit in there. And so some of them were quite eager to move on. More of them might have gone if they'd had more financial resources. I think also, quite a few people realized that your prospects, if you were the first group of people heading toward a colony, weren't very good. And so, understandably, there were a lot of people who were hesitant to risk everything to, cross the ocean and establish a colony.
It's funny. So I live in Utah. There's a big story of the migration, the pioneers that came from the east to Utah. And I've always thought if I could go, if I was back at that time with all the difficulty that they went through, what would I have said? And I know what I would have said. I would have said, I'll wait till the spring. I'll see you next year. Tell me if there's any problems along the way. And so it reminds me, like you're saying, this is a trip that some people either financially or whatever, they weren't. Some of them didn't make that trip, but others were ready to do it. I'm curious about the actual moments that they acquired the Mayflower, or how did that connection happen? Like, did they find out about it? Did they, you know, where did they connect to the point where they could do that?
So that's a great question. So initially there were going to be two ships, one called the Speedwell and then a second called the Mayflower. The way it ended up working, and this added a bunch of additional complexity to the story, is these people generally weren't terribly wealthy. There are a couple of exceptions, but they didn't have the money required to finance the establishment of a colony. So what they did is they sent a few individuals as their representatives back to England, and they found some financial backers, people who wanted to invest in a colony. And that's typically the way a lot of sort of small scale colonies got underway in the 1600s. So that their investors were hoping that they would establish a colony, and then they would profit from it, either from trading in furs or fish, or or other goods. And so that's essentially how they pulled it off. What ended up happening was the Speedwell sprang a leak, um, a few days into the voyage, and so it turned back. And one little story that I like is there was a would-be colonist named Robert Cushman, and Cushman had been a grocer back in England. That was his original profession, and I think he was one of the representatives who'd gone to England to work out this financial arrangement. And when the Speedwell turned out not to be seaworthy, Cushman took that as a sign and an opportunity to get back on the mainland as quickly as he could. So, most people then kind of crammed onto the Mayflower if they could. Cushman decided he would stay behind, and he ended up then making the crossing in 1621 just for sort of a quick visit. And I don't know, that's a much less glorious story
Yeah.
than some like William Bradford and Edward Winslow and some of the well-known pilgrims who cross on the Mayflower, survive the first winter, then get to enjoy, the first Thanksgiving. But there were a lot of people like Cushman who quite sensibly said, if I keep going, I'm probably going to be fish food somewhere between here and North America. And, I think I'll just stay here and maybe I'll head over next year, depending on how things go.
I can relate to that.
And I love those sort of human elements of the story.
Yeah.
These were people who, they had all of the hopes and fears and trepidation that you would expect for something like this.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, the Mayflower. Let's talk about the Mayflower. Thank you for explaining that there were the two ships. I thought I'd heard that, but I wasn't sure. I'm curious, two parts. First, I'd like to talk about the footprint of the Mayflower. We've got a ship that is how big, how many compartments, how much living space, and how many people were on that ship? That's the first question, if you know anything that you can help us there with. Then I've got other questions.
Yeah. So, there are pilgrim experts who remember all of those sorts of details, Tony. Um, I'm a little bit fuzzier
Okay.
on a lot of them. So I'm gonna just apologize for that.
that's
But
that's
it's just
okay.
about 102.
Okay.
Yeah, it's about 102 passengers, and they're mostly crammed below decks a lot of the time. I forget the length of the Mayflower. It's not huge. If you go to Plymouth today, sorry for that
Sure.
noise. If you go to Plymouth today, you can see and go on a replica of the ship, which I did with my family
Hmm.
a number of years ago when I was just starting on this project. And you can quickly just picture 102 passengers plus crew,
Yeah.
and um, the Mayflower was not the passengers were not badly outfitted in terms of provisions. The one real problem that they ran into, which um, definitely affected illness and death during that first winter, was scurvy.
Hmm.
They This was just sort of getting to the point where it was becoming common knowledge that you needed to take measures to mitigate against scurvy, but they weren't quite onto it. Um, and yeah, so that but on balance, the crossing itself was really successful, except for being a little bit off course. There's even a woman who gives birth on the way. Um, there aren't any huge disasters during the crossing. I think two men die.
Hmm.
Um, one of them a member of the crew, and another young servant passenger. But for the most part, they all get there, and the problem is they basically get to Cape Cod when it's just becoming winter, and
Hmm.
that's the other element that sort of makes the first months, a bit of a disaster.
Yeah. Well, and I ask because I don't know if this is true because, but I do, I think I've been on that replica before. It seemed very tight. But, you know, you never know. And I think, whenever you're crossing the ocean back in those days, storms and stuff like that, I feel like usually people are kept below and it can get crazy. But you're right. Like, that's all in all a pretty safe or a pretty successful trip. You didn't lose, a lot of people. Um, it doesn't seem like the ship took too much damage, but who knows, right? I mean, it made it through, and that's the important thing. Um,
No, and it wasn't out of commission after getting there. It sails back to England.
yeah.
The ship is basically fine. In terms of the other ship that turned back, William Bradford, who becomes the colony's longtime governor, he and some of the others, they're convinced that the captain of that ship didn't want to make the crossing, and somehow manufactured the problem. Who knows? Um,
Yeah, who knows? Okay, the Pilgrims, they were they see land, right? Mayflower's coming to the shoreline. I'm curious about the first short, the first bit when they first got there, maybe the first month or so. Are they breaking ground,
mhm.
or are they able to utilize something that's been maybe used by somebody else? Are they the first ones to break ground on some community or a camp?
Yeah, no, they. So that's a great question. So they basically see land and are able to recognize that it's the east coast of Cape Cod. And like I said, they were aiming for somewhere in the vicinity of the Hudson River. So they try to sail south. They persuade the captain to give that a try. There are these really dangerous shoals around the southeastern sort of corner of Cape Cod, and it's too hazardous to proceed, and so they turn back, they round the tip of the cape, and they drop anchor on November 11th in what's now the harbor of Provincetown in the northeastern tip of Cape Cod. Um, and basically, then they reconnoiter. They're going to try to figure out where to plant their colony because it's not where they were aiming for. And essentially, they spend a couple of weeks sort of tromping around and exploring Cape Cod. They really don't know what they're doing. They quickly encounter some native houses or small settlements. They sort of rifle through those. They look in some graves. Um, they at one point have a skirmish with some natives who, if anything, I think are just trying to warn them off. There's not a pitched battle or anything like that. Then they decide to explore, the rim of Cape Cod. Um, I think if my own thinking is if they had arrived earlier in the summer, which in general would have been a lot more advantageous, I bet they would have kept going to the north up to the Charles River,
Hmm.
around about where Boston now is. Because when the Pilgrims eventually do that, they recognize that maybe they didn't choose the best spot,
Right.
um, but by um, a little bit after mid-December is when they settle on the place that is now Plymouth, um, and they're basically arriving. They are in a way breaking ground, but it's sort of, you could almost say, a bit of a ghost town where they end up because there used to be a substantial native settlement there, um, which would have been known as Patuxet.
Hmm.
But there was an epidemic in southeastern Massachusetts during the several years before the Mayflower. And the native population had really been decimated by disease. So it was um, basically an abandoned place where they ended up. And they start building their settlement and fort there in really the dead of winter. A lot of the passengers live on the ship for quite a few additional weeks. It's really tough circumstances in which to plant a colony.
Wow. Yeah. I didn't know that some stayed on the ship for a little bit. That's pretty interesting. Hey, we're there. Let's get off the ship. Well, I'm not going to get off yet. It's pretty tough over there. That's
All right.
interesting. Sorry, did I cut you off? Yeah.
Well, and it's safe. Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's kind of, I'm sure it's miserable on the ship at that point, but it's safe and it's secure. Um, it's shelter. It's tough work building houses in the middle of winter in Massachusetts.
Yeah. So winter, everybody, think about that. That alone is very intimidating, very scary. Try to set up a community in that situation. Were there any other um, additional struggles along with that? I mean, that's enough right there, right? And then any minor skirmishes with the locals. But was there anything else that maybe history hasn't taught us?
Uh, not really. I mean, I think one thing that's maybe useful is to think about how this might have appeared from the perspective of native peoples on Cape Cod or southeastern Massachusetts. And I think this tends to be a part of the story that we're much less familiar with. So the Mayflower passengers are not the first Europeans to poke around the area. There have been English, French, and perhaps Dutch explorers, trade who have been coming to New England already. And they've had a variety of encounters with native peoples. Sometimes good in the sense of, okay, we'll trade with you, maybe eat a meal together and go on our way, or maybe establish a little outpost for a while. Sometimes much less good. Um, so there was one ship captain. Well, a couple different ship captains really did this, but there's one ship captain named Edward Harlow who abducted five natives in the area in 1611. And there was another case of even more extensive kidnapping um, just a year or two before the Pilgrims arrive.
That's not helpful.
So, yeah. So, if you're a native individual in southeastern Massachusetts, you might have a real mixture of opinions about Europeans. And you'd definitely be aware that these people could try to abduct you. In general, the idea was take native people back to England. You could make money displaying them to paying customers. You could also train them as guides and interpreters. So, there are a couple of people, such as Squanto, who famously, are able to escape from that. Um, and at the same time, you're also living amid these just devastating epidemics. So, your society in some way is just very tumultuous. Um, and so the pilgrims are sort of just stumbling into that situation. They're not really aware of all of these things. They can very quickly see the fact that there's been a lot of death in the area, and they learn from native peoples about the kidnappings. So, they're sort of walking into a situation that um, they're not prepared to deal with. Um,
Yeah. They're probably thinking, thanks, guys, for, those who did these things before they even got there. Now they have to deal with that on top of the difficulty of setting this up in the middle of winter. You mentioned a
mhm.
captain's name, but for this group on the Mayflower, who were some of the key figures in that pilgrim group, and what were their roles in that group and community?
Sure, I'll just mention a couple names, so
Sure.
as, not to overwhelm your listeners. So probably the name that people are perhaps most likely to be familiar with is that of William Bradford. He's still a fairly young man. I forget the exact age at the time of the crossing. He'd been orphaned at a fairly young age. He has sort of a remarkable background. He becomes the colony's longtime governor. Um, Another individual named John Carver was elected as the first governor, but he dies the first winter, and Bradford becomes his replacement. Edward Winslow is also an important name. He was one of the more well-to-do passengers on the ship, and you know, during the early years of the colony, Winslow is one of the few who has a lot of sustained contact with native peoples. He travels um, fairly extensively during the first year or two of the colony, learns the local language, sometimes overnights with native peoples in their homes. So he gets a pretty intimate view of the Pokanoket or the Wampanoags, as they're more commonly called in the area. Those are two names. I mean,
That's great.
there's extensive research on so many of the passengers. It's interesting to me. There's still some cases in which we don't know the first names of individuals. So there's a James Chilton, who I think is one of the older passengers on the ship, and his wife we only know as Mrs. Chilton.
Hmm.
Um, and one thing we also don't have is any primary sources from female passengers on the Mayflower. So, you know, which is certainly a shame. But a few individuals, most significantly Bradford and Winslow, wrote extensively about their experiences in the colony. They wrote actually very little about the crossing itself and didn't write super extensively about the first dreadful win. My speculation about that is, well, the crossing was probably mostly mundane, but the first winter, I think, was just extremely traumatic. Nearly half of the passengers die over the span of 4 or 5 months,
It's awful.
and it's just really grim, and it's just and it's sort of a steady drip of death, of 10 people dying every month,
Yeah.
which is just and some of the leaders of the venture, and these are also people. It's just terrible to have people you care about dying, um, but also the viability of the colony, is very much in doubt.
Thank you. Okay. Couple more questions, maybe two or three, before we jump into your book here. Next one, religion. Religion, important to those people, I'm sure. How did that govern their daily lives? Um, even on the ship, but even when they first got there, like, did they set up the community and say these are the principles of this community? We will do this. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, definitely. So I think one thing that's really useful to know is, so out of the 102 or so passengers, a majority of them are separatists. So these people who have rejected the Church of England and have become part of what they would describe as to true churches. So for these individuals, a true church is formed when Christians covenant with each other. They then have the liberty to admit new members, discipline members, and choose their officers. Very different from the structure of the Church of England, in which, um, if somebody transgresses, there might be a bishop's court that would discipline them in some way. It could be a situation in which a local member of the gentry or a bishop would appoint someone as the minister for a parish. So for these people, only those covenanted communities of Christians, only those are true churches. And for them, that was a really precious concept. They didn't expect that everyone would qualify as a church member. And so they did make a distinction between the government of the colony and that of the church, because there were a bunch of passengers who were not separatists and did not share that precise religious vision. So in Plymouth, the Mayflower Compact establishes a body politic, which for the separatists, it's broader than the body of Christ. So essentially, at first, all adult men, more or less, are members of the body politic and can vote to choose a governor, can vote on laws and things like that. And then you have still a large number of people, but not everybody, who would be part of this covenanted church. That reality introduces a lot of tension in the colony as the years pass, because you have people come who aren't separatists. They might not be, too far off from that, but they might not have been willing to make a total break from the Church of England, and so they might not qualify for or even want to join the church. The other thing that's a bit strange and that probably people don't know about the colony is they don't have a minister for quite a few years. Their minister, John Robinson, had remained behind in Leyden. They have an elder, William Brewster, who serves as, he's the one who's leading services in the colony. But since he's not the minister, he doesn't have, as far as they're concerned, the authority to baptize children or to preside over the Lord's Supper. So it's sort of a strange church situation in the colony. And you have folks show up who have somewhat different religious visions. And as you can imagine, that leads to a lot of conflict.
Yeah. No, that's great. I kind of envisioned, I didn't know, I thought they were more consolidated, maybe just one group. So that's really good to know. That lends to some of the struggles of a community coming together with different views. A lot of times, at least for me, I always envisioned that group as very caring, loving, right? And opening their arms to the Native Americans and stuff like that. With religion, a lot of times, we have a lot of examples in history where religious people that are very strong and firm in their religion, look at others as, oh, we gotta help you. There's a problem here. How did they approach the natives? Did they get along with them well, or were they kind of like, I don't know about you guys. How did they approach that? Is there anything in history that tells us?
Yeah, no, so there was a lot of mutual wariness. So, the Mayflower passengers, as they come ashore and then as they start building their settlement, they're really worried they're going to be attacked. And from the native point of view, they can tell these people seem to be here to stay. They're also worried, they might try to attack us or abduct us. So what happens is there's mutual wariness that turns into a sort of mutual defense pact. So I mentioned that a lot of these communities in southeastern Massachusetts had been decimated by an epidemic. So, it's not all peace and harmony among the natives of the region before the Pilgrims. So there are all sorts of rivalries, conflict, and some of those decimated communities were very much feeling threatened by native communities to the north that had not been as decimated by the epidemic. And so the natives near where the Pilgrims landed, they are interested in bolstering their position vis-a-vis their enemies. The Pilgrims, meanwhile, they need help. They want to trade with native communities in the region. They don't want to be attacked. And so when the natives make contact with them, there's some discussion. It's really not clear to what extent the two sides really understand each other. But there's at least something of a mutual defense pact between. He's more commonly known to Americans as Massasoit. At least his later native name was Usamiquan. He essentially establishes this alliance with the Pilgrims, and it's that they will defend each other from outside attack. That's really good news for Usamiquan and his community. It gives them an element of protection against some of their enemies. And it's good news for the Pilgrims because suddenly they have native guides and elements of protection. Despite that, you asked, how relations were. I think that sort of mutual wariness went on for quite some time. The Pilgrims, they build a fort in Plymouth, and some of, I think probably most of them, at that point, you're sort of peering out into the wilderness and seeing potential danger and trouble. And, I think that mentality, that doesn't really fully fade away until much later in the century, after a really terrible and costly war in the 1670s. I think there are moments where English and natives get on to some degree on a more human level, including at the sort of famous and mythical first Thanksgiving. But it's tough. These people, very different cultures, languages. I think it's hard for them to feel at ease with each other, which is totally understandable.
Yeah, exactly. Trying to put myself in their place, it's like a neighborhood, and there's problems in your neighborhood, right? And you're like, oh, it must have been that times 10 for both those groups, right? Who knows what's going to happen here? Thank you for talking about that. You mentioned briefly, I think that's what I heard, Thanksgiving and the mythical first dinner. Can we talk about Thanksgiving? Like, we in America believe there was this feast of a dinner that happened for Thanksgiving. True? Not true? Can you talk to us about that?
So essentially what happens is, and you can help me think about how much this fits into your, preconception.
Mm-hmm.
But, so keep in mind, there's that devastating winter of death. Then there's, once it gets to be towards summer, there is actually an abundance of food, marine life and so forth in the area. Then by the end of that summer, the Pilgrims do have a successful first harvest. And at that point, their new governor, William Bradford, decides that they should take several days to enjoy themselves, which is great, right?
Yeah.
It's been, just a relief. And one of the things that the Pilgrims do, he sends men out fowling. So we don't actually know what they shot.
Okay.
There
What?
were turkeys in the area, so
Okay.
they could have shot
I was
turkeys.
going to ask, what is fowling? Is that hunting fowl? Is that what that is?
Yeah, hunting fowl.
Okay.
So,
Sorry. Go ahead.
it probably would have been easier to shoot, ducks. But they could have had some turkeys too. So we'll give that the benefit of the doubt, Tony. Um, and if you're out fowling, you're firing your guns, right? And the natives hear this gunfire, and they want to know what's going on. So I think around 90 native men show up to investigate, and who knows exactly what they were thinking. Maybe their new allies are under attack. Maybe they're worried their new allies are up to no good. But they show up, and it turns out everybody's at peace. And then Usamikwen's men, they go out and they shoot some deer. And there's a couple days of feasting afterwards. And I think one thing that maybe doesn't fit in with the way people think about Thanksgiving is, there are all these sort of 19th century, early 20th century paintings of the first Thanksgiving. And it's usually sort of pious looking New Englanders sitting around tables having a fine meal, maybe with a few natives in the distance. But instead, you might think around, 60 colonists. So not a very large number, and a larger number of native men there. But I actually think, even if it doesn't totally line up with the mythology, that's still one of those, good moments in the early history of what becomes the United States, because feasting together, whatever the circumstances, that's much better than fighting each other.
Right.
In terms of other mythology, so the meal, I sort of said, well, maybe turkey, maybe not. One thing that almost certainly would have been on the menu, because they were readily accessible, and people ate a lot of them, was eel. So, I don't know if your listeners want to add eel to their first, to their Thanksgiving menu this year to be more authentic.
Yeah. Crazy. Yeah, I hadn't even thought about fish really before. And I'm thinking, well, of course there's going to be fish where they're at. Of course. But eel. Oh. Yeah. Definitely not what I envisioned. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. That's helpful, so that we can think about this in the way it was, not just that picture that you're talking about. That is what probably everybody saw, that one picture of how that first Thanksgiving dinner was. And you're even saying that it was more than just a dinner. It was a few days of, enjoying the harvest and spending some time together and doing that. That's pretty cool. So I'm going to use that to propose that Thanksgiving should be 3 days. Okay.
Well, I mean, it sort of is, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, it's true. It's true. Okay, John. They knew they were pilgrims. Plymouth Colony and the contest for American liberty. Let's do a high-level walkthrough of your book. Would you be willing to do that for us today?
Sure.
Perfect.
So I guess, to avoid making it too long, this is what I have in mind. What school children will often learn is that Plymouth Colony existed for religious freedom, or something like that. Sometimes in contrast to Jamestown or Massachusetts Bay. The Pilgrims became synonymous with religious freedom, religious liberty. And what I noticed when I delved into the history was that concept of liberty was indeed incredibly important to these individuals, but not in the way that contemporary Americans think about it. So for them, the concept of Christian liberty was at the core for the separatists among the Mayflower passengers. Again, for them, that didn't mean religious freedom in the sense of choosing whichever religious option is right for you. It meant being part of a covenanted church in which people have the liberty to govern themselves. So again, the liberty to choose their own minister, the liberty to admit or expel members. For them, this sort of flowed out of the New Testament. There's a passage in Paul's letter to the Galatians, stand fast in the liberty. Now I'm gonna get the rest of it wrong. I'm kind of forgetting how it ends. But that was a really important passage to Martin Luther during the Reformation. It was also really important to the separatists. What happens is you have other people coming to Plymouth Colony and elsewhere in New England who have different ideas about what Christian liberty means. You have people inspired by Roger Williams in Rhode Island who talk about soul liberty, which is much closer to actually, it's closer to the way that many Americans think about religious freedom today. It's, that simply there can't be, there shouldn't be any sort of government coerced or controlled religious options, and there should be more expansive freedom. But that's not the way the Pilgrims thought about it. And then later on you have a lot of conflict in the colony when members of the Society of Friends or Quakers show up who also have different ideas about religious liberty. So that's why in the subtitle of the book, I talk about a contest for American for American liberty, that different people, everybody believes in this concept of liberty. They just define it differently. And I find getting into the weeds on that really interesting.
Yeah.
And the same's true when it comes to political liberty. That was also a precious concept to the Pilgrims and to other English people. For the Pilgrims, that meant at first this body politic in which men had the liberty to choose their leaders and to choose their laws. Over time, a lot of conflicts develop in terms of, well, exactly who possesses that liberty, who gets to be part of the body politic. How does that, relate to issues of taxation or, other legal issues? And so, I kind of draw some parallels between the 1600s and today, and that, if you look at American politics, say in the summer of 2024, you have two political parties that both talk about liberty quite a bit, but they mean somewhat different things when they talk about it.
Yeah.
And it's just a good reminder that you can sort of sometimes have shared language and to some extent shared values, but still have a lot of conflict about what that means.
So true. Okay, among the chapters in your book, there are a couple things I'm wondering if you could just talk a second about. Lord of Misrule. What is that?
Well, that's, I think that's a fun one. So, as I mentioned, other people would show up to what's now Massachusetts with different visions of how things could operate. So there was a man named Thomas Morton. He's part of I don't know, you could call it a bit of a dodgy venture, which basically involves transporting servants from England to the Virginia colony, which is really not a situation in which you want to find yourself if you're one of the servants. It's sort of like being shipped to your death. Um, so Morton ends up, I forget the exact details, but his vessel ends up stopping in New England, and I think there's some mishaps and false starts and things like that, and he ends up establishing a small outpost on the rim of Massachusetts Bay, sort of near what is Quincy today, and it becomes known as, it's a little bit uncertain, becomes known as Marymount, although I think that's maybe not exactly the way Morton himself spelled or pronounced it. And Morton turns out to be a prolific trader and writer. And, he, in his writings, just eviscerates the separatists at Plymouth and the other Puritans at Massachusetts Bay, and sort of describes this sort of utopian settlement in which English and natives can sort of frolic, drink, dance, and have a good time together around a maypole. And, it sort of becomes this sort of antithesis of Puritan New England. Now, I think in reality, what Morton really represents is not so much a religious or moral challenge to the Puritan colonies, but he's a competitor in terms of the fur trade. He's really shrewd. He goes further up some of the rivers to the north in what's now Maine, and so he's sort of cornered the beaver trade. And there's all sorts of rivalries in early New England. Rivalry between the Dutch and the English in terms of the fur trade, rivalry between Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth. And so Thomas Morton he calls himself the Lord of Misrule, which sort of comes from, I think, the Twelfth Night tradition, and, is associated with revelry. But he's also this shrewd competitor, and I think it's primarily for that reason that the folks at Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth confront him, sort of repeatedly expel him. He's really hard to get rid of. Kind of keeps coming back to New England. And then, he, because he's such a clever writer, he sort of leaves behind this vision of an alternative, more fun and less straight-laced New England. And, historians and other authors like Nathaniel Hawthorne, they've loved to play around with that idea for years, sort of the maypole of Marymount versus, the churches of Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay.
Yeah, cool, thank you. Two more areas from your book. Cannibals, chapter 16. What's going on there?
So, that's a good question. So, chapter 16. So, we're getting into, that gets us into the 1670s. So, there's a really regional war that, at least to the English, becomes known as King Philip's War. And it starts in Plymouth Colony and then really engulfs a lot of the Bay Colony and, Rhode Island as well. And, this is another huge episode in history, Tony. But to make a long story short, we talked about that mutual defense pact really between the Pilgrims and the natives back in 1620. And that works out well for both parties at first, but in the long run, it works out much better for the English, because what happens is, in the 1630s, you get thousands of English settlers, mostly going to Massachusetts Bay, but some coming to Plymouth. And as more come, they push out to the west and to the south. They need more land. And there are repeated, additional epidemics that afflict the native population. So their numbers tend to decline. The English numbers grow. The English, on the one hand, they would tend to say, well, look, we buy this land from the natives. But on the other hand, they create scenarios in which they really swindle natives out of land.
Yeah.
They'll get natives in debt, or they'll fine them for breaking some law or doing something or destroying some property. So there's just constant pressure on native land. And Usamiquin's, I'm blanking on whether it's his son or grandson, he uses an English name, Philip. Metacom is his Wampanoag name. So he gradually grows more and more resentful toward the English because the scenario is not working out well for his people.
Yeah.
There's sort of a series of conflicts. Relations get worse and worse. And eventually, natives loyal to Metacom attack some English settlements. From there, this just really engulfs a lot of New England. It's really costly for both sides. There's a lot of English settlements that are attacked and wiped out. Eventually, the English get the upper hand in this war. At this point, a fair number of natives, especially in Plymouth Colony, have adopted or embraced Christianity to some extent. They tend to ally themselves with the English during the war. The outcome of the war is really devastating for native communities. It ends sort of that situation in which the English feel afraid or threatened by the natives. They really have the upper hand militarily and in other ways after the war.
Interesting. And one more as we start wrapping up here. You have a section, Children of Life and Death. Wondering what's that referring to?
Yeah, so it's really referring to the referring to the outcome of that war. One of the things that happens, and this is also something that I think most people are not very familiar with, is there's extensive enslavement of natives during and after King Philip's War. There are hundreds of native non-combatants in that war who are enslaved and exported, sometimes across the Atlantic to places as far away as Tangier or maybe even Madagascar, some to the Caribbean. And then on an ongoing basis, for decades, there are a lot of natives who are, it's sort of this murky area between slavery and servanthood. And the title of that chapter, Children of Life and Death, it comes from the fact that the Pilgrims, well, I wouldn't call them the Pilgrims at that point, the leaders of Plymouth Colony, they have a debate about whether they should kill Philip's son. I don't know how old he is, maybe 6 or 10. And the government of the colony gets input from the colony's ministers, who have some disagreement about what should be done with the son. Eventually, there's a quote from one minister that they basically choose to enslave him instead of killing him. and Philip's boy goes now to be sold, is sort of the news that they settle on. So there's just there's just so much human tragedy in the 1670s, which, as opposed to 1620, is something that a lot of Americans aren't super familiar with.
Yeah.
We tend to forget about the Plymouth Colony after we get past the first Thanksgiving.
Yeah, thank you for talking about that. You're right, because it's like there's a whole nother piece to this story later on that, yeah, I don't think I mean, I've never learned that through education um, about what you talked about. Maybe some reading. That's about it. So thank you for that. So, what should people, how should they really walk away feeling and thinking about the Pilgrims? Like, you know, how should we feel about them?
Yeah, well, that's a great question.
Hmm.
I don't know. I don't really want to tell people how to feel about history, but I guess what I'd say is, Americans used to, mythologize and very much regard the Pilgrims as saints and heroes in this story. And, I think nowadays, you could find plenty of people who would want to demonize the Pilgrims as, folks who show up unwanted, take over and kill anyone who resists. And, history is almost always more complex than those sorts of morality tales or, black and white situations. Um, I would just say that the Pilgrims and the native peoples they encountered, they were people, and people are individuals, and people are different. And, both of those peoples found themselves in, just incredibly trying circumstances that were new and strange to them. And, they had the whole gamut of human reactions to them. Some moments more noble than others, other moments really, really bad and tragic. So, what I always think is, you know, history is a lot more meaningful when we can kind of scratch underneath the surface a little bit and, get to know some of the individuals involved through the records they left behind, recognize that those records are only a fraction of what actually happened,
Yeah.
and use our imaginations a bit to realize just how different those circumstances were from our own.
Great. Thank you very much, John. Hey, as we start buttoning this up, is there anything else you wanted to say about your book? This is a great topic. Your book does, I love the way you attack or approach this subject. Is there anything else you wanted to share about your work for the folks? We have talked about a lot, but you know,
Yeah. So, I mean, the book's a history of a colony, and the colony lasts for 70 years. There's just a ton of, in my opinion, just fascinating human stories between those 70 years. There's sort of high points that people might know about, like the Mayflower crossing, the Thanksgiving, the Mayflower Compact, maybe on the other end, King Philip's War. But all along the way, there are people eking out a livelihood, forming churches, having conflicts over this and that. And I think just getting to know some people from the 17th century, I think that's where the real fun in history can be.
mhm.
So, yeah, I don't know. I hope people who read the book, can enjoy it on that sort of human level.
Yeah, that's great. Um, I do. Yeah, I think when we can look at people in the real way that they, through their eyes. I love books where you can almost put yourself in their shoes for a minute and kind of see the things that happen. Really helps you appreciate some things. Um, so, what's new or what's coming down the pike for you, John? Is there anything, any new projects, plans, books? What's happening for you in the future?
Well, Tony, you mentioned that you're in Utah,
Yes.
so you and at least, some of your listeners will appreciate the next subject, which for me is a biography of Joseph Smith, which is simply called Joseph Smith, The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet.
Hmm.
And it's going to be out next summer. I don't have an exact date yet, but I'm basically done with it, and I'm really excited for that book. Had a lot of fun writing it, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people will have fun reading it.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's exciting. I'm looking forward to it. And I'm hoping to catch you. Maybe we can connect and bring a quick little piece or a summary or a preview, I should say, to the listeners about that work that you have. And there are other books that you have too. So we'll see. But I think it'd be a lot of fun. So thank you. And anything else that people should follow or keep an eye out in terms of your work going forward?
Well, I mean, Joseph Smith basically consumed me for the last 4 or 5 years, so that's really the only big thing in the pipeline.
Understood. What's the best way for people to connect with you? Is there a site that people can go to, see your current and past works, how to buy them? Of course, people can go into Amazon as well, but how can they kind of follow you?
Yeah. So well, to really follow me, you have to find me in person, because I used to use Twitter, but I basically don't use social
Mm,
media because I just don't have time.
yeah,
I do have a website, johngturner.com. I love it when people who read my books, reach out by email to chat about anything. So people are, I'm not too hard to find if you Google John Turner, George Mason, University. I love it when people get in touch.
awesome. Okay, a note to everybody out there, great topic. This is going to be a wonderful book for you to read. Check it out. What's better than to do something like this around Thanksgiving? So I want to thank you once again, John, for being on and talking with us about this topic, your book. And I do want to keep you on the line for just a minute or two after we get done. But I want to also say that I hope you have a great holiday season. Okay? And for those of you, the rest of you out there, Thanksgiving is a special time. So I hope it's the best for you and your families and your loved ones. But like always, remember, there's a lot of strange and unexpected in our reality. So keep your eyes, ears, and minds open. And until next time, stay safe. All right.
Thank you for listening to High Strangeness. This was a glance at some of the strange that exists in our reality.